Thank you, thank you, thank you, Annette. Thank you. Resuming the examination. Dr. Boswell, we're very sorry that you weren't able to join us for the first week of the examination, but we are very happy to hear from you now. We already have had discussions on the matters on which you wish to speak, but that's absolutely fine. So myself and Mr. Hatfield, who is the Joint Inspector who is examining the local plan with me, are here to listen to your comments, and we may ask the partnership to respond as well to help in that discussion. Can I just understand who might be speaking from the partnership in this session? Mr. Boyle, is it just you?
Yeah, so I'll be taking the lead initially, but we also have John Worcester and Simon Bird, and they will be responding as appropriate.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Boswell, you have indicated to the Programme Officer this morning the matters in which you would like to address the examination. So they are Matter 1, Issue 4, Bullet Point 3, Matter 1, Issue 2, and Matter 5, Issue 1, Bullet Points 1, 2, and 4. So I don't know whether, Dr. Boswell, you have seen the recording of the sessions, the relevant sessions for those matters when we did discuss them, but if you have, that might be helpful. If you haven't, that's absolutely fine. We're happy to hear from you and what you've got to say. So, Dr. Boswell, over to you now.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And so, first of all, I did want to say I really appreciate you tabling this additional session, and also for the partnership and anybody else who has turned up to this. I appreciate the opportunity. I've tried to sort of focus in on things which may not have been mentioned before. I hope I haven't actually looked at all the previous sessions, I have to admit, but I have looked at one or two of them. Yeah, it is just three issues I wanted, or three topics I wanted to look at. And if I could start with the Matter 1, Issue 4, Bullet 3, which comes under sort of legislative compliance and so on. And it's particularly, perhaps if I just read that one out so we know what we're talking about. Does the plan accord with Section 19(1)(a) of the Planning Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 and national policy in respect of climate change? I'd just like to take a moment, if I could, if sort of scene setting, with the IPCC report last week, which, because of all the other news, actually, it didn't get a very high profile. It would have been a very high profile report in the media, rather like the previous one, the Code Red report last year. I'll just read out the final section of this, and this is actually a scientific statement. This was written by scientists in the IPCC at very high confidence level, and they sort of define what that means. Extremely high percentage of scientists agreeing with this. The final statement was the scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. And in the IPCC narrative, that rapidly closing window is really the period of 2030. So that's the halfway point between now, 2020, and the end of the plan, 2038. We've got 8 years either side as far as the plan's concerned of that 2030 number. And of course, that's also, we're talking about the 2030 is also the year, we're talking about the net zero strategy and the nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement. That's 68% reduction by 2030. That's also the year for that. It comes right in the middle of the plan. So the plan isn't sort of just sort of the beginning of a process. We're right in what the IPCC are calling that rapidly closing window. And I think it's useful to remember that context in what I go on to say. So now I want to look at the legislation and planning framework context, and to point out that the GNLP plan has been developed from several years before the net zero target. The Sustainability Scoping Report, for example, was written back in 2016, 3 years prior to our government setting that net zero target in 2019. And we are actually really only beginning to see the policy sort of resulting from that target roll out now, because the net zero strategy was only last autumn. I think it was November, maybe in October, it was published. So that was nearly 2 years after, in fact, over 2 years after the net zero target itself. So we're seeing the policy come in more strongly very recently. But we actually have the plan being developed well before that target was even set. And the context of when the plan was first considered, the UK climate target for 2050 was an 80% reduction by 2050. And so there's 2 points which really come out of that. That when the plan was first being drafted, the UK wasn't even legislating to remove all emissions by 2050. It was only legislating to remove 80% of them from the UK carbon accounts. Now it is legislating to remove all emissions by 2050. It's a very, very big difference. And the second thing, which the government themselves point out, is they've doubled the, if you like, the rate of acceleration to get to that target, or the acceleration to get that target. We're now aiming at that 78% by 2035, which is halfway to 2050, approximately from now, 78%. And previously, the government was saying, well, we'll get to 80% by 2050. So we've doubled the time, so we've halved the time to get to 80% approximately. We're trying to do that by 2035 now. So what I'm saying is the climate change policy and legislation background to all of this has radically altered during the 5 years or so, 6 years that this plan has been being drafted. And that's why I think that the net zero strategy is very important, because it is now the policy delivery mechanism for the net zero target, but very little has been made of it in the plan or the other documentation. I mean, partly, it's come along while the plan was in development. That's understood, but we're already in that sense out of date in terms of plan, where we're trying to get to nationally. And I want to clarify this point. It came up with the monitoring that the net zero strategy is the delivery mechanism policies for the Climate Change Act and for the net zero target within it. And that's under section 13 and 14 of the Climate Change Act. Section 13 basically says there's a duty on the Secretary of State to prepare policies for meeting the carbon budgets. So when the net zero target came in, there was a duty for the Secretary of State to publish a policy to meet that. And that policy is the net zero strategy. And then section 14, there's a duty to report that, which they now have done effectively. And the net zero strategy, it says that itself, and that's in the document I submitted back in January, my submission. I'll read it out. The net zero strategy is the means by which we, the government, we satisfied requirements of the Act, the Climate Change Act, in relation to policies and proposals for meeting the current carbon budgets, i.e. net zero and the 4th, 5th and 6th carbon budget at the moment. And how does that link to the planning framework? Well, first of all, the net zero strategy itself does say that they will be linking it back. And they they say, and it's in my submission again, I just find that bit. They say this is within the net zero strategy. They're saying this: we will make sure that the reformed planning system supports our effort to combat climate change and help bring greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. For example, as part of our programme of planning reform, we intend to review the national planning policy framework to make sure it contributes to climate change mitigation and adaptation as fully as possible. Now, that's a review of the NPPF, which is not the 2021. That was published after the 2021 review. So they're saying there's a further review coming of the NPPF, which will link stronger with the net zero strategy. But I know for purposes here, you have to work off the 2021 incantation of the net zero, sorry, of the national planning policy framework. And I'd like to point out that in NPPF 2021 bullet 153, you have the footnote 53, which links to the Climate Change Act. And it says it in line with the objectives and provisions of the Climate Change Act. So 153 is saying plans should take a proactive approach to mitigating and adapting to climate change, with that footnote in line with the Climate Change Act. And so what I'm saying is that in line with the Climate Change Act means in line also now with the net zero strategy, because that is the delivery policy, the government's delivery policy for the Climate Change Act. And that incidentally is why I was saying it was important for that monitoring, the GNLP 27 monitoring to link in, because it is actually putting the monitoring in line with current government policy. So that's really laying out what I'd say that the sort of the up-to-date legislative and planning framework is, from my perspective. I now want to sort of home in, given that update, on what the issues are. And obviously, I know I wrote a rather long Regulation 19 submission. I'm trying not to repeat that, but sort of highlight points with the emphasis of this update I've just given on the legislative framework, if that makes sense of what I'm trying to achieve in this next bit. So I think the overriding issue with climate change in the plan is that the plan gives no sense of success of what its objectives and ambitions for climate change would be. And this, of course, takes one into the the territory of measurement and quantification and targets and so on. I think there's actually there's quite a bit of confusion around what that means. But I think fundamentally, what is needed, and particularly, of course, needed in terms of the soundness principles, is a sense that we know how successful the plan would be. And currently, I can get no sense of how successful the plan would be in delivering its climate change policies as they are, which I don't think is very much, but also in terms of aligning with national policy. I mean, for example, whether you want to frame it in terms of targets or indicators or quantification, there's no future scanning of, at the moment, of what the plan would be delivering in terms of carbon and carbon emissions at, say, 2019, which was, if you like, a sort of a baseline with the regulation 19, and 2030, which is the 68% target in the net zero strategy, and 2035, which is 78% target in net zero strategy, with no sense of how the plan would align and could say it's successful or not on that. Moving on to the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act, Section 19(1)(a). There's two phrases in that I'd like to emphasize, and then talk about what I think those should mean and how I think the plan does not actually deliver any sense on those. So if I read out that clause of the Act, it's the development plan documents must, taken as a whole, include policies designed to secure, so designed to secure is one phrase, that the development and use of land in the local planning authority's area contribute to the mitigation and adaptation of climate change. The other one is contribute. And whereas there's a confusion about budgets and targets and indicators, I think it comes back to how much the plan should own carbon reduction. And I agree that's a serious issue. What I think is that it hasn't actually been addressed in the plan. And as I laid out in my Regulation 19 submission, I believe there's a simple threefold division which can help with this. And the first is that you have local areas and you have national, and you have the national country. And there's going to be a split between how much carbon reduction can be delivered nationally and how much by local areas. Then you have a second split, which gives you the threefold, that within any local area, or the combination of local areas in the partnership, you have non-planned strategies. So those might be any policies of the local council which are not in the local plan. And you have local plan policies, and there's a division there. But ultimately, each of those three components, for us to be successful nationally in the objective of delivering the Climate Change Act, we need to understand the ownership of those. And the Climate Change Committee and the government and the net zero strategy actually go some way to help with the first of those divisions, the one between national and local. It was in my Regulation 19 submission, quoting the Climate Change Act, the Climate Change Committee, because it was in one of their documents, but it's actually turned up now also in the net zero strategy on page 263, where it says central and local government will need to work closely together to deliver net zero and our interim carbon budgets. Government analysis suggests that over 30% of the emission reductions needed across all sectors to deliver on our carbon budget targets, as set out in the strategy, net zero strategy, rely on local authority involvement to some degree. So the government and the Climate Change Committee are giving us a good steer on that first split between national and local ownership. They're essentially saying the local ownership is somewhere around or over 30% contribution to carbon reduction. So Then there's a question which is down to local authorities themselves, I think, and is not answered anywhere else I found so far, is how much of that 30% do you say is delivered through local plan, and how much is it through non-plan policies? And that's really where we get into, you know, the issue of ownership. How much should the plan own, and how much does that link to non-plan policies? And I think that's where the confusion lies with targets in all of this, that we somehow have to find a way to set ambitions so that they can be quantified for the local plan, which fits that three-way split and is a reasonable ownership between the local plan and the non-plan policies at the local level. And that issue I just don't feel has been addressed at all. I do think other local authorities are addressing it, and there are other local authorities who are putting targets in their local plans. For example, Cornwall and Plymouth and Greater Cambridge are ones which have been in the media recently about that. So it's not that it can't be done, but I think it does have to be done on a local level, and it does need engagement by the partnership with, you know, back to the local authorities to work out how that would be done. Just as a sort of bit of an aside, this is a sort of small point in a way, but the statement A13, which was the letter to you, so back in July, on page 13, talks about the climate change targets in the plan. Now that's on page 13 of the letter. And it says the climate change targets in the plan are intentionally linked to those of the government. I actually think that statement's very problematic, because elsewhere the partnership have argued that they shouldn't have targets in the plan. And my belief is that there aren't any targets in the plan. There's ambitions, possibly objectives, but not targets. So just want to sort of point that out. But I believe that statement in, as I say, on document A13, page 13, is actually a full statement in that sense.
Mr. Boswell, I just wonder if now might be a good time for the partnership to respond to some of those points, if you've reached perhaps a natural break in what you were saying.
Pause point. You know, I did want to talk about soundness, but I'm very happy to have a break and hear what the partnerships say, and then come back to soundness if I may, sir.
I think if you had reached a natural pause point in what you were saying, I think it would be helpful just to hear a response to the partnership from some of the points.
Yeah,
just to prevent it reaching just to give them a point to come in at this point.
It is very important that we understand, Dr. Boswell, what changes you're seeking to the plan to make it sound. No doubt you're going to come on to talk about that in a moment, but that's what we're here to understand is the changes that are necessary for soundness.
Yeah.
So we're absolutely clear.
Absolutely.
Mr. Earl.
I'll just begin briefly talking about targets. We have accepted that across the monitoring framework as a whole, we will be putting in more targets. In relation to climate change indicators, we have our targets are linked to the government targets. That is our intention. That's a deliberate intention. Now, since this is a legal question, I'll pass you over to Simon Bird.
Thank you, sir. And I start at the beginning where Dr. Boswell referred to the legislation and the fact that clearly the local plan's been developed over several years, and obviously the net zero target is more recent. But of course, the process as a whole has been an iterative one, has been subject to iterative SA, and of course the climate change objective has been consistent. The change in target does not alter the objective. It doesn't alter the strategy of the plan, which has been assessed against that objective and has sought to identify the strategy which best serves a range of objectives, but particularly in terms of climate change. As far as the net zero strategy, to which Dr Boswell has referred extensively, that's not a coate delivery mechanism in the sense that it defers a lot of, as it were, what it intends to achieve, either to future regulations or to future policy. He's referred to the reference in the net zero strategy to planning policy. So if your notes, that's in page 267 of the net zero strategy, paragraph 31, where it says national planning policies already recognise the importance of sustainable development and make clear that reducing carbon emissions should be considered in planning and decision making. It then goes on to say the government is considering how the planning system can further support our commitment to reaching net zero. So that, in a sense, is work in progress. Equally, in terms of energy efficiency of buildings, which we touched on earlier, again, in the net zero strategy, it defers that in chapter 3, page 146 of the net zero strategy, to building regulations. And we know that the building regulation changes are promised, and we know that there's the interim future homes provision, which we've referred to already in the examination, and which modifications will deal with in terms of the requirement. So effectively, the net zero strategy delegates to subsequent documents and doesn't, in fact, set any clear planning policy framework, which differs from that set out in the MPPF, particularly chapter 14. And so the footnote in paragraph 53 to the MPPF effectively at the moment is circular, because it effectively takes you back to the MPPF, because there is no other at the moment planning policy. And in terms of measuring the success of the plan, as Mr. Burrell has said, that will be addressed through monitoring, and we've heard the debate about the targets and the changes which we're prepared to accept in relation to the proposed modifications to the monitoring, and those will be done by reference to the national targets. And so that's consistent with the MPPF. It's consistent with the statutory duty contained in section 19(1)(a), and there is no requirement, no statutory requirement for local targets. And Mr. Boswell just took you a few moments ago in the net zero strategy to page 263. He took you to paragraph 8 on 263 of the net zero strategy, but the preceding paragraph is paragraph 7, which says there are currently no net zero statutory targets on local authorities or communities, and we do not believe a new general statutory requirement is needed, both because of existing level of commitment, and it's difficult to set a uniform requirement that reflects the diversity of barriers which exist. So it's not a requirement of the net zero strategy that the council should have a locally devised target. And there is a difficulty, and I think in fairness, Dr. Boswell recognised this in terms of the work undertaken by the Climate Change Committee and indeed the government more generally. Although there is effectively a breakdown of the national target to local authority level, that is a pan-local authority breakdown, it's not, as it were, broken down to those functions which are within the purview of a planning authority and those which are within the purview of local authorities more generally, including in particular highway authorities, and of course the importance of sustainable travel in terms of the climate change agenda can't be overstated. So there's no breakdown effectively, and therefore it's not realistic to identify, as it were, a local plan target discrete from a local authority target. And it's relevant to note in that context that the Climate Change Committee itself, in terms of its recommendations to government in relation to local authorities, was that local action plans were one means which could be considered in terms of, as it were, devising the local targets. It did not recommend, as it were, that local plans in themselves should set a target, recognizing that, of course, the issues are broader and much of the climate change agenda will have to be driven by matters which are outside the purview of a local plan, not least existing dwelling stock and the need to improve the efficiency of that existing dwelling stock. So that's why the council considers the national target approach as the right one, and it's, as you've heard, prepared to include that within the monitoring strategy. Whilst others may be taking a different approach, that does not mean that the council's approach is either not consistent with section 19(1)(a) or the MPPF, or is otherwise unsound. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Bird. Dr. Boswell, you wanted to
Yes.
then move on to soundness.
Yes, if I could continue. Just on what Mr. Bird said, I don't believe the footnote 53 is circular in all senses. I understand the sense in which he made it he said it was circular, but in terms of having targets to align to in the planning framework, it's not circular, because those targets do exist in the carbon budgets and also in the delivery pathways in the net zero strategy. So those are whatever you want to call them, targets or pathways which the planning system should be seeking to align to. That footnote's not circular in that sense, so it may be circular in other senses. I think it's. I'd agree. This is very confusing. What the net zero strategy has done to sort of refer it back to another version of the NPPF, but the targets exist now today. Moving on to the soundness. I go through the 4 points to positively prepared, effective, justified, and consistent with national policy. And some of this I did lay out in my Regulation 19 submission, bullet points 14 to 19. I've tried to sort of make that a bit clearer in what I'm going to say now. In terms of positively prepared, there's no evidence provided how the plan will achieve its stated ambitions. And I think this is very different from just having a monitoring framework. A monitoring framework is establishing whether you've actually done something after the event. But what the section 19(1)(a) is saying, that plans should be designed to secure. And what we actually need for the GNLP is evidence that it is designed to secure the ambitions it's stating it wants to achieve on climate change. And at the moment, I can see no evidence there. There's no evidence base for the ambitions it's got. So in that sense, it's not positively prepared. And it's also not in line with the legislation of being designed to secure. There needs to be some quantification, whether you have targets or not. And as you know, I think it's probably a point we agree on, that you can't enforce targets in local plans, but quantification is highly important in order to know whether what you're saying you're going to achieve, whether you've actually designed the policy so you are going to achieve it. And leaving it to a very weak monitoring system, which I do take, is from the previous session, will hopefully be upgraded considerably, but leaving it to a very weak monitoring system later to find out later you haven't achieved it is not being positively prepared. I think it goes back to the climate change statement in the document. It is effectively being presented as a proxy policy. However, it actually provides no strategic policy development on climate change. It's just a fragmented set of references to other policies. And it was added in after the early consultation. So it was sort of retrofitted to policies as they'd already been developed. It's very hard to see how it's positively prepared to secure, to be as designed to secure objectives on climate change. So to fit what I'd like, what I'd like to see being different, and you asked me what that would be first of all, a much greater evidence base on how the plan is designed to secure the objectives it's got in it, which include now the net zero alignment with the net zero strategy targets. And secondly, well, I think there should be a strategic climate change policy in there. And the climate change statement just doesn't add up to what's needed. There's also no analysis in the plan on how to avoid lock-in to things which make things worse for climate change effectively or increase emissions. And for example, there's no analysis of how to avoid lock-in to gas-based central heating in housing, removing gas from our housing stock as we build it.
Mr. Boswell, sorry to cut in.
Yeah.
And apologies to everyone in the room. I've just had a message from my wife that she's inadvertently locked my son out and he's due to get home from school in the next minute or two. This is an area Mr. Warden's led on. So don't mind if I just duck out the meeting for literally 1 minute to unlock the door. I do apologise. My son is literally on his way home from school. I'm very sorry. It's a message that's come through urgently a second ago. Like I say, Mr. Warden's led on this point, so I don't think there'd be anything lost if I leave the meeting and come back in at a minute's time. Mr. Warden, who perhaps writes this section of the report as well. I do apologise. I'll return in less than a minute, but please feel free to continue in my absence.
Okay, if you're happy, I will continue then. And there's certainly, I was talking about avoiding lock-in, and there's certainly no analysis of how to avoid lock-in to car-dependent development in the plan. And in that sense, I would say rather than being positively prepared, it's negatively prepared. Picking up on points I made in the Regulation 19 submission, that in terms of positively preparing, policies must include mechanisms that provide certainty that emission goals will be met. And there needs to be robust evaluation of future emissions. And that's what I mean by we haven't actually had an evidence base, because there's been no robust evaluation of what future emissions may be. I tried to do that in my Regulation 19 submission, not as a formal, this is, right, but a pointer on the sort of quantification which could be done. And, just doing something which is informal as a sort of pointer, brought out some fairly interesting facts, which I still don't think have been addressed at all in the plan, about the amount of emissions from the development in this, and about how bringing in much stronger policy on how the housing is built would reduce those emissions. Also links to housing numbers, of course, as well, and also about avoiding lock-in to transport emissions through car-dependent development. Just pausing for a moment to look at my notes.
We do have all your written submissions, Dr.
Yeah, you
Boswell.
do. I know. Yeah, and I'm trying not to sort of repeat things from that. I mean, I think in terms of the consistent with national policy aspect, I've sort of covered that in sense, and I take the point Mr. Bird said that it's an iterative process, but at this latest stage, we're sitting with regulation, effectively the regulation 19 document, with very minimal modifications to it in the letter to you, I think it was the A13 letter last summer, and that document is sort of 18 months old, and even though actually the nationally determined contribution had been published by the time of the regulation 19, it didn't make any reference to that, and it hasn't been updated for the net zero strategy, which came out in autumn last year. So I would suggest strongly that to bring it in line with the NPPF and that footnote 53 pointing to the Climate Change Act, pointing to the net zero strategy. The net zero strategy does need to be considered for the final iteration of the plan, and it hasn't been yet. I had some comments on the climate change statement.
This is a climate change statement in the local plan, Dr.
Yeah,
Boswell.
that's right. Yeah. There is a statement on the location of development policies 1 and 7 that the final sentence says the distribution of the great majority of growth thus reduces the need to travel. I don't believe that's true, and when we come to look at the sustainability appraisal in the next matter and issue, I'll sort of expand upon that, but it's very clear historically that initially the sustainability appraisal showed that the urban-based development rather than dispersed rural development was preferable from a climate change point of view, and sustainability appraisal objective 2. And then that was altered later, and we then had the plan coming forward with much greater dispersion into rural development than the options which came out as scoring high on that sustainability appraisal 2 option. CPRE have written on this, and I want to add one more thing in the next matter, but on top of that, but I don't want to sort of go on stuff CPRE have already said, but I'm just saying that statement in the climate change statement that the distribution to great majority of growth reduces the need to travel is not true in my view. And then just a couple of sentences down on policy, the design of development. This is under the subsection design of development. Policy 2, in conjunction with other plan policies, requires development to be designed to minimize emissions. I don't believe there is a policy that actually does that. And I'd also refer you to the Centre for Sustainable Energy response at Regulation 19, which showed how, well, essentially backward looking the policies on minimizing emissions in the buildings are, and they made comparisons with other areas and so on. That essentially I think there's policies talking about reducing emissions, but not minimizing them. They're not going all the way to absolutely minimizing them. And that's the point there. Also make another point on the section that says support of delivery of decentralized renewable low carbon energy generation and grid infrastructure. In other words, energy and renewable energy, that this will become more important with what's happening with the geopolitical situation, the obviously terrible situation in Ukraine. But we're already seeing the government saying that we need to look for opportunities to maximize energy production and to get off Russian gas and oil. And part of that from the government is to expand renewable energy. They also are talking of, in fact, they're at the G7 today talking about all this, that they're also talking about opening up oil and gas in the North Sea. Personally, I don't agree with that, but we have to find a balance to maximize our energy independence, and renewable energy, maximizing renewable energy will be part of where the government go on that, whatever other energies they're looking at. And I think in terms of the months we've got before the plan is finally adopted, that is an issue that probably needs to be looked at, because this geopolitical situation, very sadly, is not going to disappear. So I just sort of throw that up. The final point I had on the climate change statement was about the monitoring, and it's to a certain extent it's already been covered, but I think the partnership, and Mr. Barrell earlier said that they would include the net zero targets, the 68%, 78%, on the monitoring GNLP 26, I think it was. No, sorry, 16, GNLP 16. I think that there probably needs to be a sentence or clause added to reflect that at this level in the climate change statement, if the climate change statement remains. As I've said, I'd rather see what I'd call a fully strategic climate change policy, which is a separate policy on climate change. But in the situation where the statement stays, that needs to be strengthened, I think, on to say the monitoring regime is reflecting the net zero strategy. At the moment, it's saying to bring all greenhouse gas emissions to net zero 2050. I'm just saying, in parallel to the discussion we had earlier, there's a clause to add in about 68% and 78% from the net zero strategy. On this section, I've just got one other thing to say, which was about the costing of climate change. And I put something in on this in my January the 16th submission, which is about the new carbon pricing data from the Treasury and from BEIS, which has been put out there for appraising all sorts of policy. I'm encountering in other areas in terms of appraising road schemes, for example. But it's effectively quadrupled the price of carbon in policy appraisal. And the point I was making is that with the local plan, there has been no indicative quantification of the cost of carbon. And I gave an example that in my indicative quantification of carbon, which, as I said, was only indicative and not meant to be, formal or final or anything, but I found 3 megatons of CO2 might be possible that's the sort of order of magnitude we're talking about. If we tighten up the policies, have some impact on the housing numbers and so on, I think we could squeeze something like 3 megatons of carbon dioxide out of the plan over the plan period. And that would be costed on the, I think it was the 2020 value of carbon. And these values actually go up over time at 720 million. So, 750 million effectively. So quite a large amount of money there, which hasn't actually been taken into any account in the economic modelling of the plan. And I would suggest as time goes forward that this is a failure in the planning system actually, and in this particular plan, not to look at the economic modelling, to not price in carbon. And carbon's going to be priced in increasingly. And actually coming back to the Ukraine crisis point, very strong renewable energy policies will have a positive impact on reducing that carbon cost. And with things like the Ukraine crisis, we might actually see the sort of cost of carbon going up further, possibly, but I don't know, that's speculation on my part. But it's certainly the point I'm making is that we haven't made any quantification or even acknowledged that there's a very high economic price associated with the carbon associated with this plan, and even the savings possible would, have a significant economic impact. That's everything I wanted to say on that matter and issue, and thank you very much for giving me the time to do that.
Thank you, Dr Boswell. Does the partnership wish to respond to the points that Dr Boswell has made?
Yeah, once again, I'll make a very brief response, then pass you over to Simon Bird. We've already mentioned that the 78% reduction target has been included in what's sort of been submitted. In terms of the climate change statement, I believe it does an effective job in signposting people to those elements of the local plan that do their best to address climate change issues, such as the promotion of decentralized energy. We have a very positive policy for that, and designed to reduce emissions, supported by a sustainability statement. Now, that's all I'm going to say. I'll pass you on to Simon Bird.
Thank you, Mr Bowell.
So yes, just touching on the issue of soundness, which is the heading really to this section of Dr Boswell's submissions. He started with section 19(1)(a) of the Act, which has been very carefully worded by Parliament. It says development plan documents, so that's plural, must taken as a whole include policies designed to secure that the development and use of land in local planning authorities area contribute to the mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. Dr Boswell's apt, I think, both in his oral submissions and in his Regulation 19 statement, slightly to misquote section 19(1)(a). It isn't designed to secure of themselves mitigation and adaptation to climate change. They need to be designed to secure that the development and use of land contribute to the mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. That's recognition of the point I've already made, that the plan will sit within the context of other local strategies, both the local transport strategy, but also other initiatives, together with building regulations. And that is an important point, because again, it comes back to the really Parliament recognising that there is only so much that a local plan can do, given that it is concerned with development management of largely future development, which does not presently benefit from permission. As to the climate change statement, Mr Burrell's addressed you on that, but its purpose is, as he's pointed out, to signpost what the policies do, and then we go back to section 19(1)(a), which is look at the plan and the development plan as a whole, rather than just individual policies. So it's the suite of policies that you have to look at, together with the suite of the development management policies which will sit beneath that. But importantly, the climate change statement, and this is the last section of it, have an effective monitoring regime, does refer back to the net zero target by 2050, which we've already picked up. As to how the plan prevents locking in, that again, you have to look at the overall suite of policies. And this really comes back to what is it that Dr Boswell says the plan should be saying that it's not presently saying, particularly in the context of, for example, policy 2, which deals with matters such as the design of development and how effectively going forward development will be designed and indeed located so as to comply with the climate change objectives. As to the absence of any evaluation of future emissions, that's not actually fair. I know Dr Boswell has criticisms of the approach taken in the Sustainability Appraisal, but that does actually undertake a high-level appraisal of both the baseline and future emissions, both to guide the strategy, but also to guide the policies of the plan. And I don't understand him actually to dissent from the conclusions drawn in the Sustainability Appraisal from that high-level work, albeit he criticises it, in terms of, for example, the emphasis on locating development where it can be served by public transport and the urban focus. And again, I touch on the point he raised there about it not being correct that the predominance of growth in the plan area will have that urban focus. But as we have already seen at the earlier sessions, actually the option chosen for the strategy of the plan, which was option 7, has the least amount of growth in the villages when compared to all the other options which were considered as part of the spatial strategy. It is very much looking at the growth overall, an urban focused strategy with the vast majority of the growth focused on the growth area. So we really come back to what is it that Dr Boswell says that policy 2, I think in particular, should say that it doesn't presently say. And that really seems to be the principal substance of the arguments being raised. And you've heard our defence of policy 2 already, and I don't intend to say any more at this stage.
Thank you, Mr. Bird. We had some concerns about policy 2. Mr. Hatfield led the session on policy 2, and the council are looking at potential modifications in relation to that policy anyway. So that policy may well look slightly different to the one that is in the submission plan.
So yes, when I said I should say that, obviously acknowledging the fact that we have indicated we're preparing to make modifications to it.
Indeed, I wasn't criticising Mr. Bird. I was just making the point that we that policy is likely to change anyway. Dr. Boswell, can we move on to? I'm conscious of time, and I know that you want to make some other points in relation to some another I think an issue about sustainability appraisal, and then you've got comments about matter 5. So I'm conscious that we have to be fairly sharp in terms of how we fit this into the time that we've got.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. If I just say one comment on the semantics of the section 19(1)(a), I do believe that where it says includes policies designed to secure, that the design to secure is referring to the policies. And I'm not quite sure if I understood whether Mr. Bird was saying something different to that, but it is the policies we're expecting to be designed to secure. And I believe that's what the legislation means. But anyway, I'll leave it at that on that point. Moving on to the sustainability appraisal, and this really can be quite brief, really. I just wanted to pick up on the written statement from CPRE on matter 1, issue 2. Shows a table at the top of page 3 where they show how the sustainability appraisal 2 objective has been changed in terms of how it assesses different growth options. But what I wanted to go, it really was a step further than that. And this comes back to what I was saying. I don't believe there's evidence provided for the sustainability appraisal or for the plan that it's going to deliver what it says on carbon. To a study which was done on the Cambridge Greater Cambridge local plan, and I apologise that I only submitted this morning. I think I thought that CPRE had already submitted this actually because I talked to them about it. But there's a figure in that Greater Cambridge local plan. This was actually a study commissioned on the carbon emissions impact of the plan, and there's a figure 3, which shows the emissions for 2030, which is the mid-plan year, rather similar to here, with the different dispersions in the plan. And it's quite clear from that if you go for village development, you get a very large impact on the carbon. If you go for densification, which is effectively what might cause urban area, you get the smallest impact on carbon. What I'm saying is that we have not seen for this plan, the GNLP, any attempt to do a sort of carbon appraisal like that, and that is the piece of evidence that I think is really missing. And it's the evidence which should tell us one way or the other whether the plan was going to deliver what it says it's trying to deliver, its aims and objectives, and also whether the policies within it are actually designed to secure those objectives. And I think missing in the whole process in this plan is that piece of evidence for the evidence base. And until we have that, we've no idea how the actual quantities of carbon produced by rolling out this plan are going to happen. We can only make speculations about them and about their potential to be successful. And I think that feeds back to the soundness tests, because I've said earlier, it's not been shown that the plan will be effective as far as climate change, because it hasn't had such a quantification. That's all I really wanted to say about the sustainability appraisal. I want to give the partnership a chance at this point to respond to that.
Yes, I'm happy to ask Simon Bird to respond on that.
So if I could just touch on the Greater Cambridge report, which I think Dr Boswell submitted this morning. I think it's important to note firstly that the Greater Cambridge local plan is an emerging local plan and is still at a very early stage. And you'll note from the appendix to the document which Dr Boswell submitted that it says in terms that our approach is highly innovative in plan making, and to our knowledge there's no precedent or commonly accepted approach exists. So at the moment it's sorry, there's a bit of feedback.
Yeah, to my.
Sorry, so I hope that's cured the feedback issue.
That's fine, thank you.
So as far as the Greater Cambridge report is concerned, as I say, it's innovative, it's untested at the moment, but importantly, actually, it simply is a different way of doing what the council's sustainability appraisal does, because effectively what it does is an overall calculation, and what it concludes is that in terms of the major contributions to climate change, they will be from embedded carbon, transport, and energy use. that the emphasis in terms of spatial options should be on those which minimize the need for private cars, and that applying a zero carbon policy effectively results in a dramatic improvement of options and indeed a narrowing as between comparative options. And so it really identifies that transport is a key consideration. Well, that in a sense is precisely the conclusion reached in the sustainability appraisal of the Greater Norwich Plan. So we come back to the MPPF, which requires a proportionate evidence base and a proportionate assessment of plans. And the approach taken by the GMP is proportionate. It tells you exactly the same as the Greater Norwich work, the Greater Cambridge Partnership work actually tells you, that the focus should be on the growth area, which it is. And it also, as Dr Boswell said, if you put all of the development in villages, which is the approach which that assessment took, then obviously that is going to be the worst performing option. It didn't then, as it were, progress through a refinement of options as the Greater Norwich Plan has through the Sustainability Appraisal. So in a sense, the evidence base is here. It's different, but it's a sound evidence base because it is sufficient to inform the strategy and policies of the plan and really ultimately tell you nothing that you would not already have known.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bird. Thank you.
Can I come back on that? Please, sir. I'd hope that, well, I hope that we would be innovative too. I have to say that was a councillor for many years pushing for innovation, right back since 2005. But anyway, I don't agree that the sustainability appraisal gives you the same as a quantified study. A quantified study quite clearly gives you another dimension in order to be able to establish whether you're sort of basically getting the numbers right. The sustainability appraisal is a very simplistic mechanism with these crosses and these coloured boxes and so on. It may have come to a similar overall conclusion about transport, but anybody could have told you that in many years that the transport was a key factor. What it doesn't do is quantify, again, how the policies are designed to secure a reduction in those transport emissions. It just doesn't tell you that, the sustainability appraisal, that where a quantified study would start to give you indication of that. And that's the real difference in the approach. There is a significant difference between quantification and qualification. There always has been and there always will be. And you can't just sort of wave hands and say, oh, the sustainability appraisal with its qualitative approach gives you everything a quantitative approach would give. It absolutely doesn't.
Thank you.
So happy to move on, or.
So well, thank you. I mean, we're not here to get agreements. What we're here to do is hear from you, hear from the partnership, and Mr. Hatfield and I will have to consider everything that we've heard during the examination and decide on the soundness of the plan. But thank you. I wonder whether we could move on to your third point, Mr. Dr. Boswell. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, this I hope will be sort of brief compared to the first one. What I really wanted to talk about was the local transport plan 4, which the LTP4, which is mentioned in that policy. If I could just have a moment actually to get policy 4 in front of me on the screen would help.
Page 80 of my plan on the
yeah, I think I'm there now. So it mentions the local transport plan on the basis of the Transport for Norwich strategy, which is a part of it. And this, of course, relates to strategic infrastructure in terms of road building largely. Sort of to give you some background, so what's been happening with the county council and their local transport plan, and some a legal challenge to it, which I was involved in. The strategy part of the local transport plan 4 document was adopted by Norfolk County Council on November 29th, 2021. But since then, we've had a legal exchange under pre-action protocol rules and so on, because we didn't agree with the adoption was sound. With that exchange has actually sort of finished now. We're basically sort of in two positions, but I think what came out of that exchange, and I can submit this as evidence and with the public information provide that to the hearing, is a number of conclusions, and these came out of what the county council said back to us in their response to our pre-action protocol letter. And the first is that the local transport plan 4 document, which is the strategy document, the one which is adopted, does not of itself amount to a full local transport plan in accordance with the Transport Act 2000, section 1083, which is the part of the Transport Act which defines what a transport plan, local transport plan, should comprise. So the local transport plan document does not comprise in itself a full LTP. So we haven't actually got the full local transport plan 4 on the table. The next thing which came out is that document, the local transport plan 4 document which was adopted, will be reviewed and completed at a time when one further document, the local transport plan 4 implementation plan, is published, and that, according to the county councils, expected to be published sort of the back end of this year. I think they were talking about a year from when they adopted the plan, so sometime this autumn would be when they are saying that implementation plan will be available. But the key point here is that the local transport plan strategy and policy document will be reviewed and completed at the same time as that. So we haven't got a full local transport plan, and the document we have is going to be reviewed in about a year's time. Also, part of that was that the council intends to review the local transport plan 4 policy document alongside the implementation plan in light of updated legislation and guidance. And that includes the transport decarbonisation plan, which states that local transport plans must set local decarbonisation targets.
Dr. Boswell, I just want to be clear. What I'd like you to tell me is,
right,
if you consider that policy 4 is unsound, tell me why the policy 4 in this local plan is unsound, right, and what needs to be changed to make it sound.
Right, the policy 4 is unsound because it refers to the Transport for Norwich strategy, which is a sub-document of the local transport plan 4, and the local transport plan 4 is not yet a fully local transport plan. In fact, the other thing, which would be my fourth point I was going to make, was that the council told us that the current local transport plan remains the LTP free, which was originally written in 2011. So the policy you've got in front of you, policy 4, can't go forward as it is, because it's based on a policy which doesn't yet exist, or certainly doesn't yet exist in full. The other thing that the council have told us was that the policies set out in the local transport plan do not include the promotional development of any particular scheme or project. And we take this to read that Norfolk County Council therefore will not be looking to rely upon the local transport plan for any planning application or any local plan policies that it might make in respect of schemes and policies that it had claimed in the local transport plan for and included for illustrative reasons. So getting back to the policy 4, all the schemes you've got listed there under that this will be achieved, basically the local transport plan 4 does not give any policy support to those. And the council have told us that it doesn't. And I think you had the question about whether those schemes should be taken out of the policy anyway and just put in supporting text. And so my answer to that would be yes, anyway. I mean, I think I was saying that anyway before this legal exchange, but after this legal exchange, we actually have the position from Norfolk County Council that the local transport plan doesn't support the inclusion of those policies anyway, so they definitely should be taken out. You then got a sort of, debate about how much they should be included in supporting text. What was said about the local transport plan 4 when it was presented at the full council meeting for adoption was that any of the schemes in it were only illustrative and were only there for illustrative purposes. So I would say that it follows that where schemes are listed in under policy 4, either in the policy itself should be taken out, but or in the supporting text, that they're only illustrative, because that appears to be the county council's position now. All the schemes there listed are only illustrative.
Thank you, Dr. Boswell. Can I have the partnership's response, please? And also, can you please explain whether the county council support policy 4?
So the county council do support policy 4, being engaged in its drafting, and you requested when we discussed policy 4 for us to consider main modifications to it. We have been doing so. The county council involved in that. You asked us to look at submitting drafts to you. No doubt you'll consider amendments that we're proposing. In terms of the other statements Dr. Boswell made, I really can't give a view on any illegal exchanges.
Thank you, Mr. Bowell. Dr. Boswell, have you got any further comments on policy 4 now? Have we dealt with what you'd like to say on policy 4?
Yeah, I think that's it, actually. I think everything else I'd already submitted at regulation 19 one way or another. So I think from me, that's it. And thank you very much for the time you've given me this afternoon.
You're welcome, Dr. Boswell. Thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you. That concludes the scheduled sessions of the examination. I believe now that we do have an admin session, which I think is set up for next Friday. with the council. Ms Feeney will confirm. And just for those who may be watching, that is just a session between the inspectors. Ms Feeney will be supporting that, but with us, between us and the partnership, and that is just to pick up the outstanding tasks which we discussed in the first admin session a couple of weeks ago, and then the tasks which we have agreed for the partnership to undertake over these last 2 weeks, and to just give any clarification and understanding of where we are on those outstanding pieces of work. It would be helpful as well for us to understand the timetable as we move forward in terms of those perhaps more longer term pieces of work that we will be expecting, that the partnership will be undertaking and submitting to us in due course. If you've got any information now, then please feel free to tell us. If you'd we get a clearer position next Friday, then we're happy to wait until next Friday. But we're in your hands. Clearly, it would be very helpful to us to understand the longer term timetable process for those pieces of work, such that we can help. We can gain an understanding of when we will come back for the hearing sessions on East Norwich housing land and then the Gypsy Traveller work.
Yes, so we'll come back to you on Friday with that timetable. In terms of the last administration session, we have responded on a number of the issues you requested information on. We will provide you with information on the remaining ones tomorrow. So you'll have a timetable for how we're going to address the remaining, for example, main modifications that we agreed needed to be made. And other than that, I don't think we'll be able to provide you with anything before Friday, but I will endeavour to do so if possible.
Thank you much, Mr. Thorpe. We do appreciate it. As you're giving things back to us, we're involved in the examination, so it's hard for us to see them. And equally, we appreciate that you're involved in the examination, and it's hard for you to keep working, and the team to keep working on these items. So we really appreciate all your work that's going on behind the scenes. I mean, I know what we see here is what we see, but actually behind the scenes, we know that your team is working very hard on those pieces of work. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, sir. And we will now be able to spend more time on working on those pieces of work.
Ms. Feeney.
Thank you, Inspector. I just wanted to remind people that whilst the administration session is just between the GNLP and yourself, it will be recorded and it will be available on YouTube for people to observe, as is the part one session is on there as well, so people can see what's been discussed.
Thank you. Are there any other matters that the partnership wants us to be aware of at this stage?
There's nothing from me.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you for all your contributions over the last 4 weeks of the sessions. We've had some very long days, and I'm grateful for the team's contribution and commitment. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we will adjourn this. Well, we will finish the session now, and we'll see you in the admin session next week. Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Boswell. Thank you.
Thank you all.